For most of its history, nobody really talked about Girona FC. Not in Spain, not in Europe, and certainly not outside of the football circles in Catalonia. They were simple there. A small club from a small city, living in the shadow of one of its biggest football institutions the world has ever seen. Because only a short drive away stood Barcelona. A club with legends, trophies, global attention and an identity so powerful it completely dominated football in the region. And next to that, Girona barely existed. For decades they moved between divisions, struggling to stay relevant in a football system that rarely leaves room for smaller clubs to dream. There were failed promotions, painful playoff defeats, seasons where the club came close to disappearing back into obscurity. Nothing about Girona suggested greatness, and maybe that is what makes this story so difficult to understand right now, because somehow the club nobody cared about became one of the most exciting teams in Europe, not through history, not through massive spending, but through belief, and a style of football that made an entire country pay attention. Welcome to Hidden Club Stories, where every club carries a story. This is the story of Girona. This video is sponsored by Hidden Shirt Club. They sell premium football shirt mystery boxes with real stories. If you want to discover your own story, you can use code TRIFINO10 at checkout. Girona is not a football capital. It is a quiet city in Catalonia, known more for its streets, rivers and historic architecture than football. And for years, that was reflected in the club itself. While Barcelona became one of the most powerful football institutions on earth, Girona remained small, local and largely ignored. There are no global superstars, no major trophies and no expectations that this club would ever compete with Spain's elite. Most seasons were spent fighting in the lower divisions, simply trying to survive financially and remain competitive. And over time, Girona became the kind of club people rarely talk about. Not because they were hated, but because they were invisible. Football in Spain revolved around the giants: Real Madrid, Barcelona, Atletico Madrid. And clubs like Girona were expected to know their place beneath them. But beneath that quiet image, the club was slowly building resilience. Because after years of failure and disappointment, Girona had developed something incredibly dangerous: patience. And eventually, that patience would begin to change everything. Long before the success, there was frustration. Girona came painfully close to promotions multiple times, only to collapse when the pressure became unbearable. And nowhere was that pain more visible than in the playoffs. Season after season, the dream seemed close enough to touch, and then suddenly it disappeared. They conceived late goals, they missed a lot of opportunities, and the defeats that stayed with supporters for years. For many clubs, repeated failure eventually destroys belief. But for Girona, something strange happened instead. Every collapse made the club slightly stronger. Not emotionally, not financially, but mentally. Because over time, Girona stopped behaving like a club terrified of failure. They became calmer, more organized, more prepared. And eventually, after years of heartbreak, they finally reached La Liga. For most newly promoted clubs, simply surviving would have been enough. But Girona's story was only beginning. Because at that moment they finally reached the top division, football itself was changing. When the City Football Group became involved with Girona, reactions were mixed. Some people saw opportunity, others saw danger. Because by that point the football world already understood what the City Football Group represented. Global ownership, modern scouting, data-driven recruitment, and a network of clubs connected through structure rather than geography. And suddenly, little Girona became part of that system. But what makes this story interesting is that Girona never truly lost its identity. The club didn't suddenly become a Spanish version of Manchester City. There were no Galacticos, no impossible transfer spending, no overnight transformation into a super club. Instead, the changes happened quietly. Smarter recruitment, better infrastructure, a clearer football philosophy. Girona began finding players other clubs ignored, players who fit a system rather than a reputation. And slowly, the level of the club started rising. Not dramatically, but enough to create something incredibly important: stability. And once stability existed, Girona could finally start dreaming bigger than survival. When Michel arrived, Girona changed. Because what made this team special was not simply that they won matches, it was the way they played them. Girona attacked fearlessly, pressed aggressively, and moved the ball with confidence even against clubs far bigger than themselves. And slowly, something unusual started to happen. Teams with more money began struggling against Girona, teams with bigger reputations started looking uncomfortable. Because Girona were no longer playing like a small club trying to survive, they were playing like they belonged. And under Michel, players started reaching levels nobody expected from them. Football that should have looked reckless somehow became organized. Fast attacking sequences became natural, and the confidence became part of the club's identity. And while bigger clubs carried pressure every week, Girona played with freedom. That freedom became momentum. And that momentum turned into one of the most unbelievable seasons Spanish football had seen in years. Because suddenly, Girona were not fighting for survival anymore, they were fighting near the very top of La Liga. There are moments in football that completely change how a club sees itself. For Girona, hearing the Champions League anthem was one of them. Because not long ago, this was a club fighting through playoff failures in the lower divisions, and now they stood among Europe's elite. And maybe that's what makes this achievement feel so unreal. Not because Girona had become the richest club in Spain, but because they had done something far more difficult. They had built an identity strong enough to compete with teams that were supposed to be untouchable. The small club from Catalonia had forced Europe to pay attention, and suddenly, Girona were no longer living in Barcelona's shadow, they had created their own story. One built not on history, but on vision, courage, and belief. Girona's rise says a lot about modern football, because this story could never have happened 20 years ago. The scouting, the structure, the data, the global networks, all of it helped to create the foundation for what Girona would become. But systems alone do not create stories like this, because in the end, people still matter. The players who believed, the supporters who stayed and supported the club, and the coach who convinced a small club to stop fearing bigger ones. And maybe that is why Girona feels so fascinating. They are both an underdog and a symbol of modern football at the same time. A club built through modern ideas, but carried by emotion. And somehow, against all odds, it worked. Thank you for watching this episode of Hidden Club Stories. If you want to discover more clubs with identity, history and soul, make sure to subscribe. Because somewhere out there, another story is already waiting.